Before we dive into this exciting and twist-filled story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories we'll be sharing. Get ready to follow Madeline's journey, a woman who, after surviving the Titanic disaster, finds the strength and courage to rebuild her life. This is just the beginning of many more stories of overcoming adversity and redemption that we have for you. So sign up now and stay informed about everything. John Jacob Astor IV, a name that echoed through the luxurious salons of American high society, was a man everyone looked upon with a mixture of respect and envy. With an immense fortune derived from real estate and railroad businesses, and a nearly unattainable success story, he felt untouchable, immune to rumors and criticism. But the truth was that inside, Astor was far from the man everyone saw. At 47, age was beginning to take its toll, and he felt the weight of the expectations of his inheritance. In 1912, the Titanic's maiden voyage became the biggest social event of the year. A luxurious ship, the latest marvel of engineering, with enough space to accommodate even the richest and most powerful passengers of the time. Among them was Astor, accompanied by his wife, Madeleine, a woman 19 years younger than him, whose youth and beauty did not go unnoticed. What intrigued society was the fact that despite his enormous wealth, Astor had married such a young woman, and the rumors about the motivation for this marriage were countless. Madeleine, who was pregnant with her first child, seemed to be the perfect counterpoint to Astor's image, but their marriage was anything but ideal. She, with her radiant eyes and enchanting beauty, was being observed by everyone. He, with his solid presence, exuded a confidence that contrasted with what he felt inside. Their marriage was seen as a strategic alliance both for Astor, who sought someone to give him an heir, and for Madeleine, who wished to ascend to the top of society. However, there was more at stake than just appearances. Astor, behind his unbeatable facade, was beginning to face the consequences of decisions he himself had made. His fortune was being eroded by bad investments and hidden debts. As he settled into his luxurious cabin on the Titanic, he didn't know that this voyage, which was supposed to be his escape to a new life, would be his last. Astor's story wasn't just about wealth, status, and fame. It was also about an internal battle against his own mistakes and the impending downfall of a man who always believed himself indestructible. The Titanic, the greatest wonder of the world, was about to show Astor that even the most powerful structures can fall. The stage was set. The ship was at sea, and the beauty of the open ocean made everyone feel as if they were floating in an endless world. But inside the Titanic, the future of Astor and his wife was about to be shaped by a single tragic destiny. The clash between the grandeur of the ship and human vulnerability would be evident in the hours that followed. What do you think motivated Astor to stay in his marriage despite the criticism and difficulties? Leave your opinion in the comments. As the Titanic cut through the icy waters of the Atlantic, John Jacob Astor began to reflect on the days that had passed. His life had always been marked by luxury and ostentation, but no one knew the weight he carried in his soul. Astor was a ruthless businessman, always ahead of his time, but now he found himself trapped in a marriage of convenience, without the passion he had imagined possible. Madeleine, his young wife, had her own reasons for marrying him, but Astor knew that love was not one of the main ones. She wanted a position, a legacy, an ascension to the elite. Madeleine came from a well-to-do family, but nothing compared to the grandeur of the Astor family. She knew her future was secure with him, but that didn't stop her from feeling a growing loneliness. The pregnancy, which should have been a symbol of renewal and joy, was accompanied by a hidden anxiety. She knew she needed to be by Astor's side, but he was becoming increasingly distant, both physically and emotionally. She also felt the tensions, the expectations of society, and the weight of being watched in every move, every gesture. Among the first-class passengers, the couple was constantly observed. The elite world was attentive to every word and gesture of Astor and his wife, fueling the rumors that swirled around them. The conversations were always about the size of Astor's fortune, about the unlikely marriage, and of course about the future of the family. But nobody knew what really happened inside that luxury cabin. Astor and Madeline, with their different views of life and the future, were growing increasingly distant, but both, silently, clung to the only thing they had left, the public image of a perfect marriage. The ship, with its grandeur and opulence, reflected the world Astor inhabited. It was a microcosm of the elite he represented. The glittering lights, the ornate halls, and the crystal goblets were like a mask hiding weaknesses and flaws. The Titanic, with its wealthy passengers, was a symbol of the apogee of Astor's empire, but no one knew that, soon, all of this would be ruined. At every turn on the ship, Astor was confronted with reminders of his own fragility. He knew that the Titanic's grandeur meant nothing in the face of the vastness of the ocean, and that however invincible the ship seemed, it too was vulnerable. A growing sense of unease gripped him. What seemed to be the last voyage of his life was laden with meanings beyond his comprehension. The Titanic itself, which he imagined to be a symbol of human superiority over nature, was merely an illusion, just like his own power. Madeleine, on the other hand, was living through her own internal struggle. She knew her life was about to change forever. She was pregnant with a child who would not inherit Astor's fortune, and the pressure to ensure her child had a bright future was becoming unbearable. Society viewed her pregnancy as a promise of stability, but she feared what might happen if the unexpected occurred. Among the other first-class passengers, some people began to notice the couple's discomfort. Whispered conversations about Astor and his wife's emotional state began to spread, while tension aboard the Titanic increased as the voyage progressed. However, what no one knew was that, even with his wealth and status, Astor was more vulnerable than he had ever imagined. Do you believe that Astor and Madeleine's marriage was merely a matter of convenience, or was there something more complex behind this union? Leave your opinion in the comments. As the Titanic sailed through the icy waters of the Atlantic, the atmosphere of unease on board became palpable. This was due not only to the personal tensions of John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeleine, but also to the growing anxiety about the journey ahead. With each passing day, the voyage seemed more like an escape than an adventure, and the couple found themselves increasingly in a sea of uncertainty. The calm that enveloped the ship was an illusion, a reflection of the luxury in which they lived. But behind the facade, the cracks were beginning to show. Astor, increasingly isolated in his own thoughts, spent hours in his cabin, reflecting on the choices that had led him there. His financial worries were a constant, but what bothered him most was the feeling that the world was turning against him. What he feared was not only the end of his fortune, but the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. The enormous pressure to maintain the image of success, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness, was becoming unbearable. Madeleine, on the other hand, spent her days amidst the ship's luxurious lounges, but her mind was far away. The pregnancy, which should have been a symbol of renewal, now brought a greater burden each day. She knew her future depended on Astor's stability, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of hopelessness that gripped her. She felt disconnected from her husband, and her mind wandered to thoughts about what the future held for her and the child she carried. She wanted more than the life she was living, more than being seen merely as the wife of a wealthy heir. External pressure was also mounting. Rumors about their marriage, speculation about Astor's financial situation, everything seemed to be taking its toll. Every glance exchanged between the other passengers was a reminder of the weight of society on their heads, the social class they lived in. The society that watched their every move was becoming an invisible trap, but one that imprisoned them in every possible way. At a gala dinner on board, where the rich and powerful gathered to display their opulence, Astor and Madeline were surrounded by curious glances. But while everyone around them seemed immersed in frivolous conversations about business and wealth, the couple was lost in their own dilemmas. The night wore on, and with it, the realization that something big was about to happen. An unease swept through the room, a collective premonition that tragedy was approaching. But what no one knew was that that very night, the Titanic had struck an iceberg. The impact was so sudden that the entire ship shuddered, and a wave of panic quickly spread through the corridors. However, at first, the reaction of the captain and crew was calm. The Titanic, it was believed, was indestructible. But a sense of fear began to creep into the passengers, and amidst the growing agitation, personal and social tensions that had previously seemed distant began to gain momentum. Astor, realizing the chaos unfolding around him, felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. It was as if the ship and his own insecurities had symbolically collided. Fate was giving a clear warning. No human construction, however imposing, was free from the threat of the uncontrollable. Madeline, frightened, clung to him, seeking safety, but he knew in his mind that this was no longer a luxury trip. It was a race against time, a race against destiny itself. As the Titanic continued its uncertain course, the situation on board became increasingly chaotic. Astor and Madeline were in the midst of a conflict that was becoming more physical, more urgent. The fear of death began to mingle with their own inner demons. Madeline, in her search for safety, tried to protect her son, while Astor, in his solitude, pondered the mistakes that had led to the impending disaster. How do you think the impending Titanic tragedy affected the relationship between Astor and Madeline? Leave your opinion in the comments. The chaos aboard the Titanic intensified by the minute. The iceberg collision had started a race against time, and as the ship began to slowly list, panic spread through the various classes. In first class, where high society was accustomed to luxury and tranquility, the fear was palpable, but the passengers tried to maintain their composure, with a few exceptions. Astor, despite the growing dread, was focused on a single thought: how to protect Madeleine and her unborn child. Meanwhile, Madeleine was in a state of shock. She, who had always felt secure in her social position, now saw everything crumbling before her eyes. The idea of losing her life at the height of her youth and status tormented her. But more than that, she felt a weight on her conscience, a growing regret for not having done more for her relationship with Astor. She knew that despite his own dilemmas, he was now as lost as she was. Amidst the chaos, she realized the fragility of life and the uncertainty of the future. She still wasn't sure if she loved Astor, but of one thing she was absolutely certain: he was the only person who could guarantee her survival. Meanwhile, the crew was trying to organize the passengers for evacuation. However, a cruel dilemma was forming. There weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. While some of the first-class passengers were being directed to the boats, others, particularly those in the lower classes, were forced to stay behind. This social division, which seemed so irrelevant during the luxurious voyage, now revealed itself in all its cruelty. Astor, always a man of principle, found himself torn between saving himself and his wife or trying to ensure the survival of everyone around him. The society that on the surface seemed sophisticated and united was proving to be a farce. Fear and instability caused people to reveal their worst instincts. First-class passengers competed with each other for space in the lifeboats, while others fought to escape imminent death. Astor, observing all this, began to question the values he had been taught. Power, wealth, and social standing were nothing compared to the immensity of the ocean, which was now swallowing the Titanic with relentless force. He had never imagined that his life would reach this point, where his fortune and prestige would be useless. Madeleine, alongside Astor, was about to make a decision that would change the course of her life. She knew that if she was to survive, she would need to distance herself from her public image and fight for herself. Her focus became protecting her child. The love for a future life, for something yet unborn, began to eclipse her own insecurities and fears. She decided to fight for her survival, not for luxury or status, but for the chance of an uncertain but perhaps more genuine future. Amidst the chaos, some secondary figures, such as other first-class passengers and even crew members, began to show their true nature. Some tried to act like heroes, seeking to save as many people as possible, while others succumbed to despair and selfishness, ignoring even the pleas for help. The clash between the different character types aboard the ship became a metaphor for what was at stake: the struggle for survival. And in the end, this struggle was not about wealth or power, but about something far more primal. The contrast between Astor's actions and the growing chaos around him illustrated the relentless reality that fate cared nothing for social status. The inequality that existed between passengers of different classes could not be more evident. The mistakes he had made throughout his life, always seeking more power and control, now seemed a cruel joke in the face of the vastness of the sea, which made no distinction between men. Nature was imposing its own version of justice. Do you believe that Astor and Madeleine's struggle for survival was more a matter of instinct or a decision born of love and regret? Leave your opinion in the comments. The Titanic was now in a state of complete chaos. The collision with the iceberg had only been the beginning, but the true impact was being felt in the lives of the passengers. As the ship slowly sank, fear and uncertainty began to grip everyone on board, and the reality of the impending tragedy set in. The elegant ocean liner, which until just minutes before had seemed unshakable, was now falling apart before their eyes. For John Jacob Astor, the situation had never been clearer. He found himself facing a cruel truth. Nothing in his life, not even his great fortune or social status, could prevent what seemed inevitable. He had dedicated his life to building an empire, but now he was being forced to confront the fact that death made no distinction between rich and poor. Not even he, the richest man on board, would be spared. The Titanic made no distinction between social classes, and the vast cold ocean was about to swallow everything. Astor found himself in a dire situation. With the lifeboats filling up rapidly, he knew his only chance of survival was to ensure the safety of Madeleine and the child she carried. However, the escalating chaos made any rational action nearly impossible. He desperately searched for a solution, but as the ship began to list further, uncertainty about the future overwhelmed his mind. Death seemed like an uncertain yet growing shadow drawing near. Madeleine, in a state of shock, clung to her husband with unexpected strength. She knew her fate was now intertwined with his, but there was something deeper in her eyes. Not just the terror of the moment, but the realization that, ultimately, her and Astor's lives hadn't been built on what truly mattered: genuine love and human connection. The Titanic, in all its grandeur, became a metaphor for their lives, something built on appearances, but which deep down was about to crumble. The crew tried to remain calm, organizing the evacuation, but panic had gripped most of them. In a moment of pure adrenaline, a flight officer ordered that first-class passengers be prioritized, which caused a direct confrontation between the different social groups on board. The lower-class passengers, who had been left behind, began fighting for a place in the lifeboats, while others, who had already been rescued, watched indifferently. It was then, amidst this turmoil, that Astor had a sudden and devastating revelation. Observing the commotion around him and the behavior of the people, he realized that, however much he had dedicated his life to power and prestige, he could never control destiny. The immensity of the ocean, the uncontrollable nature of tragedy, made him see that in the end, everything he had achieved was worthless in the face of the vastness of the sea. The turning point came when, while trying to reach a lifeboat, Astor was forced to make a decision that would change everything. He had to choose between saving himself or his wife. With the ship already listing drastically, he made the hardest decision of his life. He pushed Madeleine into the lifeboat, asking her to survive for him, while he stayed behind, condemned to face the inevitable. "I love you, Madeleine," he whispered desperately as he pushed her towards safety. He knew that she, with her child, would have a better chance of surviving. And in an act of desperation, Astor climbed to the upper deck, where the last lifeboats were being launched. But before he could reach one, the icy water had already engulfed the ship's structure. Madeleine, in tears, watched her husband being swept away by the waters. There was no more time for goodbyes. She was pushed into the lifeboat, her body trembling with cold and fear as the Titanic sank deeper and deeper. She turned one last time, searching for Astor, but he was no longer there. The Titanic, a representation of her life, was going down, taking with it her riches, her ambitions, and what remained of her hope. Do you believe Astor made the right choice in prioritizing the survival of Madeleine and her child, or should he have tried to save himself? Leave your opinion in the comments. The Titanic was sinking rapidly, swallowing the grandeur of its own existence. The icy waters of the Atlantic engulfed the ship, and darkness spread, submerging not only the ocean liner, but also the dreams and destinies of those aboard. The Titanic's lights, once shining with luxury and opulence, went out one by one, giving way to chaos, fear, and despair. Within this turmoil, the true face of each passenger was revealed. Madeleine, safe in the lifeboat, watched the ship's destruction from afar. But the sight of the Titanic sinking wasn't the only impact she felt. In her heart, a deep pain took hold, an indescribable sense of loss. The image of Astor being swept away by the waters was the only thing she could see. She had survived, but the price of that survival was unbearable. The tragedy didn't free her from her own emotional prison. The guilt of having survived while he perished was a difficult burden to bear. In her thoughts, Madeleine wondered if, during all the time she had been by Astor's side, she had truly known him. Their relationship, marked by a difference in age and interests, now seemed distant and irrelevant. She had survived the Titanic, but, in a profound sense, she had lost something far more important. A part of herself. The weight of guilt and doubt about her choices would never leave her. She was now alone, carrying not only the pain of losing Astor, but also the responsibility of an uncertain future. Outside, the chaos of the sea was in utter disarray. Fear and despair were visible on the faces of the survivors, while others, who had been rejected from the lifeboats, struggled against the despair of knowing that death was imminent. But while Madeleine and the other passengers tried to escape, the ship succumbed to the icy waters, taking with it the remnants of the elite, the wealth, and the society that at some point seemed indestructible. Astor, on the other hand, was lost in the ocean, trying to stay afloat for a few more seconds. The vastness of the water and the darkness of the sea swallowed everything around him. There was no more luxury, no more prestige, and not even the strength of his fortune could save him now. In the last moment of his life, he realized that death, like the sea, was relentless and egalitarian. It didn't matter who he was, what he had, or what he had achieved. He was at the mercy of fate. A final reflection ran through his mind, a somber thought about his life and the mistakes he had made. He had lost his way and was now being consumed by that which he had always tried to control, the immeasurable and uncontrollable destiny. As the Titanic sank, survivors were rescued by other ships, but the psychological scars of the tragedy were impossible to erase. Madeleine, with a vacant stare and aching chest, gazed at the horizon, unsure of what to do next. She had lost her connection to what was important, to what truly mattered. What would she do now? How could she move on after such a loss? These questions echoed in her mind as the aftermath of the tragedy still hung over her. She could not return to the life she had led before. The society she knew, with its judgments and expectations, now seemed distant and irrelevant. Survival meant something different, something she did not yet fully understand. The truth was that Madeline, like everyone else, was transformed. The Titanic took more than lives that night. It took illusions, status, and the belief that human power could defy nature. Do you think Madeline managed to find a way to overcome the tragedy of the Titanic, or was the loss irreparable? Leave your opinion in the comments. The ocean, which had swallowed the Titanic and taken so many lives, still held within it the memories of that magnificent ship. For the survivors, the journey between tragedy and survival was a thin line. Madeline, now rescued and safe, felt the weight of emptiness within her. What was left of her? The woman who was once the wife of the Heir Astor, who possessed everything, was now alone in the world, without riches, without status, and most painfully, without her husband. In the first few days after the rescue, Madeline was immersed in a sea of confused feelings. She didn't know how to define herself or how to move on. The woman who had known a life of luxury and glamour now faced the harsh reality of loss and rebuilding. Her heart was still bound to the memory of Astor, and the grief over his death was profound. But as time passed and reality set in, Madeline realized she couldn't remain in that pain for much longer. She began to realize that, however devastated Astor's death had been, her own life still lay ahead of her. And however unsure she was of what to do, there was something inside her that propelled her forward, something that made her desire more than a life of lament. She knew that if she survived, she would need to find a purpose beyond what she had known before. The luxury, the parties, the appearances, all of that now seemed futile and distant. What she wanted most was to discover a new version of herself, a woman who could transcend the mistakes of the past, who could find strength in the ashes of tragedy. Madeline began to get involved in helping other survivors. During the crossing back to the United States, she dedicated herself to supporting those who had lost family and friends. She realized that her pain, though immense, was shared by many around her. As she began to offer comfort to others, she discovered an inner strength she didn't even know she possessed. Her empathy for others and her ability to listen became her greatest qualities. The fragile and lost woman who boarded the Titanic was now emerging as someone different, someone who understood the value of life in a much deeper and truer way. The impact of this change began to be felt in her daily life. Madeline distanced herself from the society that had previously welcomed her, seeking new paths, new horizons. She no longer wanted to be the wife of a rich man living in the shadow of his fortune. The truth was that she didn't know what the future held, but she was willing to face it, no longer as a woman dependent on a powerful male figure, but as someone capable of creating her own destiny. Although the pain of losing Astor would never completely disappear, she began to see the tragedy as a form of liberation. His death, though painful, had forced her to grow and evolve. Madeline was no longer the fragile young woman who had boarded the Titanic. She was now a woman with a clearer vision of herself and the world around her, and in a way, she felt that Astor, even in death, had given her a gift, the chance to live for herself. Growing up wasn't an easy journey for Madeline. The memories of the Titanic, the chaos and the loss were still vivid in her mind, but little by little she rebuilt her life, stronger and more aware of the choices she made. What once seemed like an endless tragedy now seemed like an open door to a new life, a life she hadn't chosen, but one that would be hers. The return voyage to the United States marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. When the ship finally docked, Madeline disembarked with the other survivors. But unlike many, she wasn't seeking recognition or compassion. She was seeking her own freedom, a freedom that the Titanic and its tragedy had taught her to value. Do you believe Madeline's true triumph occurred when she found the strength within herself to move forward? Or did the tragedy leave scars that could never be overcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. Time had passed since the sinking of the Titanic, but for Madeline, the scars of the tragedy were still fresh. She had returned to the United States, where she was welcomed as one of the few survivors of the disaster, but the reality of returning was difficult to face. Her home, her old life, the status she once held, all of it seemed distant and almost unattainable now. The world she knew, which adored her as the wife of John Jacob Astor, was now in ruins. However, she was determined not to be defined by a legacy she did not choose. Madeline began to get involved in philanthropic work, trying to help the families of other Titanic survivors. But society wouldn't leave her alone. The media was obsessed with her. She was the only survivor who truly seemed to have lived aboard luxury. But now, in her reconstruction, she no longer wanted to be remembered only as the wife of a famous man. She wanted to be seen as someone independent, someone who made her own story from the ashes. Despite this, her true battle was only beginning. The grief over Astor continued to weigh heavily on her, but not as before. What she had finally realized was that the pain of his loss had become a burden she didn't need to carry forever. Astor's death, though tragic, freed her from an emotional prison she didn't even know she was living in. But as she moved forward, a part of her heart remained tied to the past, to the image of a woman who had been pushed away from her true identity. It was then that an invitation arrived. An old friend of Astor's, someone she knew from past parties and dinners, was organizing a large charity gala to raise funds for the victims of the Titanic. At first, Madeline hesitated. Her nature of being in the media, exposed as an icon of the tragedy, bothered her. But at the same time, she knew that this could be her chance to turn the page once and for all, to begin a new phase, far from the shadows of her previous life. She knew that her decision to attend the gala wouldn't just be about the event itself, but about taking a step toward closing a chapter she was ready to leave behind. But as she prepared for the evening, a sense of anticipation hung over her. This gala, seemingly a mere social formality, would become an emotional battleground, and she would need to decide what she truly wanted for her life from then on. The gala was a lavish event where upper-class people gathered, still maintaining the facade of prosperity that the Titanic represented. Madeline knew she would be surrounded by the same faces that had watched her wedding to Astor, those who saw her as the heir's wife and nothing more. Now, she would be the woman who had survived the greatest maritime disaster in history and risen again. But the truth was that how she presented herself to these people would be crucial. Madeline was torn. Going to the gala meant confronting her past directly, but at the same time, it could be a chance to finally cut ties with a life that no longer represented her. She knew that by facing the old figures from her life, she would also have to confront her own insecurities and fears. Looking in the mirror, she reflected, "Who am I now?" The woman she was before the Titanic no longer existed, and perhaps neither did the woman who was about to enter that gala. The woman reflected in the mirror now was someone new, someone who had survived not only the disaster, but also her own vulnerability. She was ready to show the world who she really was, without the veil of wealth or social approval. Do you think Madeline's decision to attend the gala represents a complete overcoming of her past, or is she still trapped by societal expectations? Leave your opinion in the comments. The gala night arrived, and Madeline found herself facing a monumental dilemma. The ballroom was filled with people who somehow still saw her as the widow of John Jacob Astor, the man whose eyes were fixed on the future and whose hands built empires. To those around her, she was still a woman marked by her tragedy. They saw her as a symbol of mourning, not as a woman who had survived, but as a reminder of what the Titanic had taken from everyone. As she entered the hall, Madeline felt the weight of their gazes upon her. Some gazes were of sympathy, others of morbid curiosity. Those who knew her before the disaster seemed to be searching for a trace of the former woman, Astor's refined wife, and could not see who she had become. Yet there was something different about her. The woman who entered that night was not the same one who had boarded the Titanic months before. She had been forged in the depths of the ocean, and more importantly, in the void that followed the loss of everything. As she moved through the hall, a familiar conversation caught her attention. A group of old acquaintances were discussing the Titanic tragedy, but the tone of the conversations was always superficial, as if the disaster were a distant episode, something that wouldn't directly affect them. It was at that moment that Madeleine realized the disconnect between her pain and that of others. For her, the Titanic had been more than a collective tragedy. It had been the death of a life she no longer recognized. It was a reminder that the life of wealth and privilege she had led before was merely a facade she herself had helped to build. And then, at that very moment, she found herself facing a reflection of the past. A man approaching her with a charming smile, someone who, in fact, reminded her exactly of the life she had lost. He was an old friend of Astor's, someone from her class, a man who represented everything she had once been, and everything she now despised. He smiled, extending his hand as if it were a greeting of old friendship. However, in his gaze there was something more, an expectation, an attempt to recover the status she had somehow left behind. The man began to speak of bygone eras, of the grandeur of the Titanic, and of how society would never be the same after the disaster. He was more interested in the memories of high society than in the lives that had been lost. It was as if he saw Madeleine as a piece in a game, a piece that for a moment he thought he could put back in its rightful place in society. But at that instant, Madeleine realized the irony of it all. He was still trapped in a world she now saw as empty, something that no longer represented her. With an enigmatic smile, Madeleine looked into the man's eyes and said, "The Titanic was more than a disaster. It was a lesson that everything we build in our lives can be ruined in an instant. And in the end, it's not power or wealth that defines us, but our ability to start over." Those words fell in the room like a bomb. The man looked at her in surprise, not fully understanding what she meant. But Madeleine, at that moment, understood. She no longer needed anyone's approval. She no longer needed to be seen as Astor's wife or as a survivor of the tragedy. She had become someone completely new, someone who understood the true meaning of life, someone who knew that true strength came from within. As she walked away from that group, Madeleine felt a wave of freedom, like never before. Those words were not merely a protest against the man who wanted to put her back in the place he thought she belonged. They were a cry for freedom, an acknowledgement that she had finally broken free from the chains that bound her to her past. She had taken the final step on her journey of self-improvement, no longer defined by luxury, tragedy, or the society that judged her. Madeleine now had a new vision of herself. She was no longer seeking the acceptance of others. She had accepted herself. The woman who had survived the Titanic, grief, and the emptiness of loss was now stronger than ever. What do you think was more liberating for Madeleine? Her words to the man, or the decision to leave behind the woman she was? Leave your opinion in the comments. The days following the gala passed quickly for Madeleine, but something inside her had changed forever. The gala was no longer just a social event. It was a moment of true rebirth. She no longer felt like the woman who had lost everything on the Titanic. The pain of loss, though ever present, had lost its power to control her. The tragedy no longer defined her. After the event, Madeleine dedicated herself to social and humanitarian causes, something that had fascinated her even before the disaster, but which she had never had the courage to fully explore. She used her story to inspire others, recounting her journey not only as a survivor, but as someone who rose from destruction to find a greater purpose. Astor's death, though terrible, gave her the chance to rebuild her life, redefine her values, and live for something that had real meaning. She also began helping other Titanic survivors, especially those who had lost everything and were trying to rebuild their lives. Over time, she became a respected figure, not for her wealth or status, but for her dedication to the well-being of others. She demonstrated that even after the greatest tragedy, it is possible to find a new path, a new reason to live. What surprised everyone most, however, was Madeline's decision to open a shelter for widows and orphans, an initiative she felt deeply in her heart. Through this center, she helped countless women and children restart their lives, just as she had done. This project became a symbol of her personal transformation, something that connected her to all the other victims of the tragedy, and, at the same time, freed her from her past. As the years passed, Madeline found a new peace. Although the grief never completely disappeared, she learned to live with it, to accept it as part of her story. She had found a balance between the pain of loss and the joy of discovery, and this made her an even stronger woman. One spring morning, many years after the shipwreck, Madeline gazed at the sea horizon. The Titanic was no longer a shadow in her life. She had found the peace and serenity that had once seemed impossible to attain. The sea, which had once carried her away from everything, now symbolized the freedom she had gained along her journey. She was ready for the future, certain that no matter what fate had in store for her, she was capable of handling anything. Do you believe Madeleine found true happiness by dedicating herself to others and leaving her past behind? How do you see her journey after the Titanic? Leave your opinion in the comments. Decades have passed since the sinking of the Titanic, and Madeline, now an older woman, continues to live in peace. Her shelter still operates, helping generations of women and children rebuild their lives. She frequently visits the survivors who are still alive, offering them comfort and wisdom acquired over the years. The world has changed, but the truth she learned remains. What matters is not riches, but human connections and the ability to start over. Madeline, with her legacy, has proven that life can flourish even after the greatest tragedies. What do you think of Madeline's legacy? How do you imagine the impact she had on people over the years? Leave your opinion in the comments. Madeline's journey teaches us that, even in the face of the greatest tragedies, it's possible to find a new path, reinvent ourselves, and help those around us. If you felt inspired by Madeline's story of overcoming adversity and transformation, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moments in this story touched you the most? And how do you think her life could have been different if the Titanic had never sunk? Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends. Let's spread this message of hope and strength.